Alright, so today we're going to be going over the hippies and social justice. So we're going to be talking about, specifically, we're going to be answering the question actually, how was the hippie movement related to social justice during the Alright, so today our topic is the hippies and social justice. Our research question that we're going to be attempting to answer with the information in the presentation today is, how was the hippie movement related to social justice movements in the 1960s? Alright, for our agenda today, we're going to go over some definitions of some important key terms throughout the presentation that I just want to make sure y'all are informed on, just so we have a fair playing field of understanding all of the content. And then we're going to be going over illicit drug use, social justice movements, as well as the response to the hippie movement, and specifically the political response to the hippie movement. For our definitions today, we're going to go ahead and define hippie as a usually young person who rejects the morals of established society, as by dressing unconventionally or favoring communal living, and advocates a non-violent ethic. So then, for psychoactive drugs, we define that as a drug or other substance that affects how the brain works and causes changes in mood, awareness, thoughts, feelings, or behavior. And we'll go over this a little bit more in a couple slides, but I want to preface by saying that the psychoactive drugs that we're usually referencing in terms of the hippie movement are marijuana or weed and acid and other hallucinogenics. Mushrooms were also very common during this time. And honestly, any hallucinogenic or drug that affects the brain and how you visually see the world. And then social justice is defined as justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. Alright, so for increased illicit drug use in the 60s, we definitely saw a skyrocket. Now, unfortunately, back then, there wasn't as much of an established way, or not even way, but there wasn't an established reason, I guess, to survey people and to do all of the psychological studies that we have going on every day currently. There just weren't as many of them. It wasn't as common. And so, unfortunately, we're not able to see the exact stats on, or at least not stats that were taken in the 60s. We're not able to see those stats on just how much the illicit drug use did increase, but we know that it did. because of an increased amount of those drugs in the US in general, and then of course with the hippie movement. So drugs such as acid and other psychoactive substances saw a huge increase during the hippie movement. They're known for easing the mind and making the user feel as though they have philosophically freed themselves from mainstream society, which of course is a very, very similar sentiment to the hippie movement. And as you can see on the left here, this is a primary source of some people who did self-identify as hippies with a sign selling acid. Now, I don't know too much context around this photo, but this just shows how common hallucinogenic drugs were during the 1960s and how out in the open it was, honestly. It was very much people just did it, and it definitely was not looked down upon as much as it is today, at least for harder drugs. The increased use and celebration of these drugs led hippies to be more likely to participate in social justice movements because the illicit drugs caused their minds to feel more free, and also simply to accept people of other, races or other identifying factors. So this is just a simple overview of some of the social justice movements during the 1960s, specifically that the hippie movement really intersected with. And these are the main social justice movements that we're focusing on when talking about the hippies, at least for this research question. So for the civil rights movement, we really see it as the cornerstone of the hippie movement because it was the biggest and most safe first anti-establishment movement during the 60s that really taught people that they had more power against their government than they may think. And then for the anti-Vietnam War movement, this was mainly led by hippies, and then of course in turn created an even stronger sense of that hippie subculture in America. So for the civil rights movement, it's so important to the hippie subculture, specifically because it showed that even a group that was as looked down upon as Black people and people of color in general, they were able to rise up against their government, albeit with some very, very harsh punishments along the way. But overall, they were able to rise up against the government and to demand the freedoms that they thought that they deserved. And so it really showed a lot of people who were stuck in the mainstream suburbia society that they can't stand up and ask for what they really want from their government. So this quote we have here from a secondary source, Lutfi, he wrote an article chronicling the hippies' illicit drug use and how this related to social justice movements. This specific quote, I think, really encapsulates how the civil rights movement fits into the hippie movement and how they both helped each other. It also set an example of the ability of the people to break off the established doxa and fight for their own rights to strengthen their disposition in the American society. So I think that really just encapsulates the idea of really all of these movements, the hippie movement, the civil rights movement, and also the anti-Vietnam War protests and that movement. So here we see a primary source of some protesters holding some signs. Now, in history, and even during the 1960s, 70s, when this was happening, they were made out to be dangerous, sometimes even violent, even though they were outspoken pacifists. And so this photo, I think, really does a good job of showing that a lot of the people protesting against the Vietnam War were the very men that possibly could be drafted into it. So I think this shows that it's not just outrage at a war in general or outrage at the government for simply existing, but outrage for something that these young men and even the young women would have to feel the effects from for the rest of their lives. It also showed how strong the U.S. citizens could be when they joined forces and fought against the government together instead of apart. Which, of course, leads us to the link between all of these movements. So since the civil rights movement kind of kicked things off and really showed citizens that they have more power than they thought, this also led to the strengthening of the hippie subculture, which in turn caused many protests against the Vietnam War, because it showed citizens that their government truly doesn't care about their own well-being, since they would send them to die without a second thought. And then, while both of these social justice movements occurred at the same time, it created a subculture based on rejecting mainstream society because these people could not find value there. Ultimately, the subculture came to be known as hippies. So here we have just a quick transcript, actually, from Nixon's speech where he waged a war on drugs. He specifically said that it is the number one public enemy of the United States, and that we needed to wage an all-out offensive in order to stop public enemy number one. Although an increase in illicit drug use is generally not good for any society, at the time, and even to this day, the war on drugs that was waged, often citizens saw it as a way to control citizens and to stop them from finding different or freer ways of thinking that didn't align exactly with what the government wanted from them. So it is hard to know if this is truly a response to increased detriment in the U.S. because of increased drug use, or if it was truly to criminalize people of color, not too long after they gained some civil rights, and also to criminalize people who thought differently than mainstream culture. So for this final argument here, the hippie movement in large was a response and a catalyst for protests of the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and a general uprising of citizens, and a refusal to fall into mainstream society. None of these movements would have been as successful without the support and intersectionality of the others. Thank you. And then here we have my sources listed. Thank you.